When we talk about the 5 Nordic countries, that is Denmark, Iceland, Finland, Norway and Sweden, we often talk about them in terms of a Nordic model. In 2013, in fact, The Economist did a special report on why the world should look at the Nordic countries and refer to the region as the next supermodel. What is the Nordic model and why is it justified to talk about the region in these terms? And the first thing to say is that there's no simple answer to that question. There's not one Nordic model, there are many Nordic models, and we can also talk about Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, Finnish models as well. But if I were going to try and sum it up, then I'd probably think of it in 2 different ways. First of all, that it is an academic category of analysis. When we talk about the Nordic model, we're thinking about the ways in which we compare the different countries, about the similarities and the differences between them. And from probably about the 1970s, or certainly in the 1980s, social scientists and other academics started to talk about a Nordic model as a way to structure their analyses. And this is something that social scientists in particular have been doing for quite some years now. And if we can think about what the Nordic model means in that terms, then it also has many different meanings, but to summarise it, first we can talk about it in terms of multi-party democracies, a particular party political model where the Social Democrats in particular have been quite strong, not in all the Nordic countries, but in some of them. Secondly, we can talk about the Nordic model as a model of consensus democracy, with structures that are designed to promote compromise, sometimes contrasted to more adversarial models of politics like the Westminster or the Washington system. Thirdly, as part of this culture of consensus, we can also think about the Nordic model in terms of the institutions of the labour market for collective bargaining and the negotiation of conflict. And the Saltsjöbadsavtal from 1938 is perhaps one of these cornerstones of the Nordic model, at least in Sweden, or the Swedish model in fact. And then, of course, the welfare state, the comprehensive, tax-funded, generous, universal provision of welfare benefits for all citizens, which is often assumed to be the central pillar of the Nordic welfare state. And in turn, the ways in which this has shaped the Nordic societies as successful economies with high standards of living and also with other social implications like relatively low levels of inequality and high levels of, for example, gender equality. But the Nordic model is not a fixed term. Its meanings change constantly. The perhaps classic era is the period of the Cold War, where it's also connected to the special status of the region within international politics. So the term Nordic model can be a concept for analysis in scholarly research. But it can also have other meanings. The idea of a model implies something which can be transferred or copied. And in that sense, the Nordic model is also a political concept. International interest in the Nordic region goes back a long way, but peaked in the 1930s, when the region attracted interest for its response to the twin crises of democracy and the economic Great Depression. And in 1936, an American journalist, Marquis Childs, published this best-selling book, Sweden, the Middle Way, which was very influential in establishing the international reputation of the Nordic region. After the Second World War, this interest in the Nordic region continued internationally, although this is also shaped by different political points of view, so that for many on the democratic reformist left, the Nordic countries, and especially Sweden, were the example of a strong social democratic party and government and the welfare state that created. For others on the right, it could be a worrying example of socialist control. And for some on the left as well, an example of a social democracy that wasn't prepared to tackle the root problems of capitalism. And from the 1970s, there are also emerging signs of difficulties related to the first international oil shock and the international economic recession that followed. And the Nordic countries were also affected by some of these global difficulties. In the early 1990s, everything changed. Suddenly, the Nordic countries no longer looked so distinctive or so interesting in an international context. The rise of neoliberalism meant that the social democratic idea of the Nordic model was no longer attractive. At the same time, the end of the Cold War and the end of the idea of the Nordics as a bloc between East and West seemed to lose its resonance, and the focus shifted towards European integration. And what were the Nordics to stand for within a rapidly integrating European Union? What's remarkable is that we're still talking about a Nordic model 30 years on, or nearly 30 years on. In fact, the concept seems to have experienced a remarkable resilience. This is especially the case since the global financial crisis that began in 2008. And The Economist's special issue and the idea of the next supermodel is a good example of this. But the meaning of the Nordic model has also changed. Today, politicians might just as well be referring to the idea of a Nordic model in terms of competitiveness or flexibility, or the need to introduce market reforms into state-run healthcare or education. Some on the left have resisted this redefinition. And some years ago, the Swedish Social Democratic Party in fact sought copyright of the term to try to prevent their political rivals from using it. So if we were to sum up, there's no straightforward answer to the question, what is the Nordic model? It has many different meanings, and these change in different contexts. It can be used as an analytical category to structure our research. It can also be used in a political sense, but of course its meanings vary according to whether you look at it from the political left or the political right. For some, it conjures up utopian images of a society that we would like to be, whereas for others it's a dystopian warning of how not to do it. The meanings of the Nordic model change over time and in different contexts. So actually, studying the Nordic model can tell as much about the societies that are consuming it as the ones that they're trying to describe.